about three sections each. I'll take the first three, I guess. Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah. Social relations, the subject matter. Um the only extensive discussion of Marxist concepts or categories and the conception of social reality which finds expression in them appears in his unfinished introduction to the critique of political economy. This seminal work, which was first published by Karl Kautsky in 1903, has been unjustly ignored by most Anglo Saxon writers on Marxism. Here we learn that in the study of economic categories, as in the case of every historical and social science, it must be borne in mind that, as in reality, so in our minds, the subject, in this case, modern bourgeois society, is given, and that the categories are therefore but forms of expression, manifestation of existence, and frequently but one sided aspects of this subject, this definite society. This distinction between subject and categories is simple recognition of the fact that our knowledge of the real world is mediated through the construction of concepts in which to think about it. Our contact with reality, insofar as we become aware of it, is in contact with a conceptualized reality. Yeah, yeah. So, does anyone want to take that?
And then
Can I?
today,
Hmm,
I'm asking you to do it.
okay. Um, yeah. Basically, I guess as the uh, as the highlighted lines, as like the distinction, the way we see, um, yeah, the way we understand the real world is through a concept of is through concepts. So, for example, if we take the case of water, we we can't really think or study water without having a concept of water itself. And this is, I guess, is a very rudimentary example of it, but that's generally how we think. And this might be a bit confusing right now, but it'll be like a bit more clear as we go through the rest of the chapter. I think. Yeah, is that okay?
Yeah.
Okay. What is unusual in Marx's statement is a special relation he posits between categories and society. Instead of being simply a means for describing capitalism, neutral vehicles to carry a partial story, these categories are declared to be forms, manifestations, and aspects of their own subject matter. Or, as he says elsewhere in this introduction, the categories of bourgeois society serve as the expression of its condition and the comprehension of its own organization. That is to say, they express the real conditions necessary for their application, but as meaningful, systematized, and understood conditions. This is not merely a matter of categories being limited in what they can be used to describe. The story itself is thought to be somehow part of the very concepts with which it is told. This is evident in Marx's claim that the simplest economic category, the exchange value, implies the existence of population that is engaged in production within determined relations. It also implies the existence of certain types of family, class, state, etc. It can have no other existence except as an abstract, one sided relation of an already given, concrete, and living aggregate. I think before I go on, I just want to forgot to talk about this one line, the last paragraph. Um, says it's about, it must be in the study of economic categories, as in the case, it says here that it's given that the categories are therefore but forms of expression and manifestation of existing. Uh, uh, yeah, basically what we see, um, or the concepts that we have are concepts that already exist and exist in the real world. Going on to the second paragraph. Yeah, here he's trying to say that like the definitions or the way in which Marx speaks, or the way in which Marx uses language and concepts, his concepts contain the a lot of other things within them, and even though it's not explicitly said, as is the case he talks about here, he gives an example. Says exchange value implies the existence of population that's engaged. It's because like you cannot have exchange value alone as a one-sided thing. It needs to have a population, and like a population that's engaged in production and all of these things. And it cannot, yeah, I think that's it. Is there, am I wrong? Is there anything to add?
Um, I think you have to mention this part, the one where he says that the concepts that we, the words that we use to describe the concepts, they're in itself forms, manifestation, and aspects of their own subject matter. So he's never claiming that the way we express is neutral in any way, and only the content is partial. He's he's making sure to explain that the way we understand in itself is a manifestation of reality. And again, the same thing with like words such as exchange value. Saying exchange value in itself implies that there is a population and there is production and all of those things. So he doesn't have to explicitly mention it. The word already contains all the other concepts that are related to it.
Yeah, as Isha said in like the chat, it's like he's pondering on the, yeah, he's trying to talk about the
Yeah,
relations
like
between
how,
how we, yeah,
yeah, go on.
how we think and like actual material reality, and that this is how it is. He's trying to establish it. I think I will continue. One more of the striking results of which is there. He's okay. Isha is typing something, so I'll like, wait. Material reality is like a container which gives shape to gas inside. Yeah, I guess I. So the thought expresses the container, which is material reality when we talk about any single concept, like such as here when we talk about exchange values. Here, I say. I think we'll do this after the reading. We'll go through that.
Are we waiting?
Yeah, well, I'll just
Since
continue and like we can like go through that after after finishing the reading. Um,
yeah,
one more of
Yeah,
the,
that's better.
yeah, one of the more striking results of this approach to language is that not only the content but also the categories are evaluated by Marx in terms of true and false. Thus, in criticizing Proudhon, Proudhon, Marx claims that political economic categories are abstract expressions of the real, transitory, historic, social relations, and they only remain true while these relations exist. By deciding to work with capitalist categories, Proudhon, according to Marx, cannot completely disassociate himself from the truths with which these categories contain. According to the common sense view, only statements can be true or false. And to use the same measure for evaluating concepts seem unwarranted and confused. I think I should do the next paragraph as well to then. Um,
Yeah, go
Yeah.
on.
Right.
Three conclusions stand out from this discussion: that Marx grasped each political economic concept as a component of the society itself, in his word, as an abstract, one sided relation of an already given, concrete, and living aggregate, that it is intimately linked with the other social components to form a particular structure, and that this whole, or at least its most significant parts, is expressed in the concept itself. If these conclusions are unclear, it is because the kind of structure they take for granted is still vague and imprecise. To properly understand concepts which convey a particular union, we must be at ease with the quality of this union. That is, with the way its components combine, the properties of such combinations, and the nature of the whole which they constitute. Only by learning how Marx structures the units of his subject matter, only by becoming aware of the quality and range of what is known when he considers he knows anything, will the relations between concepts and reality have been set out in these conclusions become clear. Yeah, think in the initial part where he's talking about how Marx criticized Proudhon for claiming and about political economic categories is this, I think he's talking about the way in which we see certain concepts like that already um, I guess it might be a bit abstract, but like the concept of uh, an
See,
example for this.
basically, if you guys don't know, Proudhon was an like anarchist thinker that lived in time of Marx. And Marx is basically saying that Proudhon is limiting himself to capitalist concepts. Like he's not coming outside of what is known as the capitalist common sense. Like he's seeing things in a binary of true and false, and not in like. And instead, Marx claims that the political economic categories are actual expressions of real transitory historic social relations. So basically, that you have to come outside the uh, that in order to criticize capitalism, you cannot use capitalist logic itself. In a way, I think that's what he's saying.
Yeah.
Yeah, yeah, I think so. Yeah. Like at the point at which the social relations that represent capitalism cease to exist, the political economic categories that Proudhon talks about will become false. Or yeah, I think yeah. false. And here once again he reemphasizes the idea of like an abstract one-sided relation, which is like an exchange value representing everything else that is related to it, such that like when you talk about exchange value, all of these things already exist and are there, and it's uh, yeah,
So the concepts, they form a particular structure. So we already know that they're interrelated in a way, because we mentioned that the word exchange value, it implies that there is a population, all that stuff. So there are these what do you call it, connections that we know are implicit in Marx's words, and now Allman is saying that all of these components, which is understood as social components, they are put together and they form a particular structure. And each part of that structure, in this case each concept that form that structure, contain the meaning of the structure in its totality in that particular part. So each concept he is explaining is capable of explaining the entire meaning of the structure that he creates with each individual part. Does that make sense?
Yeah. So does anyone have? Think so. Yeah. I guess I will continue. Yeah. Okay. Wait. Like, there's something to add here. Like, to understand this certain concept, which is would be here once again exchange value. We have to understand production and like a whole population that produces and all of those, and then only will we be able to understand uh, this concept that is exchange value. I think that's what he's saying at the end.
What about the particular? What are you talking about?
To properly understand concepts which convey a particular union, like wait, uh,
He's
that
saying
yeah,
you
we
must
must be
be
at
at ease with the quality of the union.
what does
That
that mean?
is the way in which its components combine the properties of, yeah, yeah. Basically, like, how is it that he's making these relations, right? Like, how does he, like, when he explains capital is the relationship between so and so. So, and like each component, each relationship, they form a structure, we said. So he's saying that if you really want to understand that all of it combines together in a union, you need to be okay with each relationship, understand the components of each interrelation,
Yeah,
and then only you'll be able to figure out the structure as a whole.
yeah.
Right. Also, can people react to this thing in the chat if things make sense? Or just unmute yourself and say yes or no, so you can go on.
I'm gonna continue. Okay. What is distinctive in Marx's conception of social reality is best approached through the cluster of qualities he ascribes to particular social factors. Take capital as the example. We find Marx depicting it as that kind of property which exploits wage labor and which cannot increase except on condition of getting a new supply of wage labor for fresh exploitation. What requires emphasis is that the relation between capital and labor here is treated here as a function of capital itself and part of the meaning of capital. This tie is extended to cover the worker as well, where Marx refers to him as variable capital. The capitalist is incorporated into the same whole. Capital is necessarily at the same time the capitalist. The capitalist is contained in the concept of capital. Elsewhere, Marx asserts that the means of production monopolized by a certain section of society, of laborers turned into independent powers, money, commodities, and even values, the value creating power are also capital. What emerges from these diverse characterizations is a conception of many tied facets whose sense depends upon the relations Marx believes to exist between its components: property, wage labor, worker, his product, commodities, means of production, capitalist, money, value. I think here here he's trying to explain the what was just said, like that is the way he treats a concept is by, yeah,
It's the
it's in
same thing
relation,
we said.
yeah, in relation with other things. Like, and it the capitalist is a part of capital at the same time. Yeah, capital cannot exist without the capitalist. It,
Right.
as it,
Like the so he's giving a, what do you call it, a definition of capital earlier, right? When you scroll up, you can see. So in that, the property between so and so is capital. So that the fact that capital reacts a particular way with property and wage labor, not property, wage labor, is a function of capital, and that is incorporated into the meaning of capital. So it's not that capital is whatever its functionality, everything that it does, its relationship with all the other factors in the structure, all of it is the meaning of capital, that one concept. The same applies to every concept. So how it works with like every other concept in the structure is a part of its meaning, and that's how it's supposed to be understood. So if we take this particular thing he's saying in relation to what we read in the earlier thing, the words like bats thing, it'll make more sense, because we said that he uses many words to mean the same things, and this, same words to mean many things. So here's the essence of that concept, is that he's saying capital is so and so, he's also saying capital can be something else, as in the relationship of the capitalist doing certain things. That is also capital, he's saying. So you get what I'm trying to say?
yeah,
Like all of these factors, they're all capital. The meaning of capital incorporates all of those things. So yeah, I think that's what he's saying here. We've covered it. Move on.
it is insufficient to accuse Marx of loose and misleading presentation, for, as we shall see, all social factors are treated in the same manner. But if it is not incompetent writing, then Marx is offering us the conception of capital in which the factors we generally think of as externally related to it are viewed as co elements in a single structure. Yeah. It is this system owning quality of capital that he has in mind when he refers to it as a definite social relationship. This conception is contrasted with Ricardo's, where capital is only distinguishable as accumulated labor from immediate labor. In the latter case, where capital is something purely material, a mere element in the labor process, Marx claims the relation between labor and capital, wages, and profit can never be developed. Marx believes he is only able to trace out these connections because they are already contained in his broad conception of capital. If they were not, he would, like Ricardo, draw a blank. Every factor which enters into Marx's study of capitalism is a definite social relationship. Yeah, I think like, yes, yeah, I don't completely understand that part.
Mm, I think it's pretty much the same thing, right? He's saying that it is the system owning quality of capital that he has in mind when yeah, okay. So he's saying that when other people talk of like the concept of capital, like for example Ricardo, because he does not incorporate all of these things, like each particular relationship capital has with all the other components in the structure, because of that he's not able to go beyond the particular definition that he himself has set. But in Marx's understanding of capital, he's already incorporated all of these relationships, which is why he's able to his which is why his conception in itself is able to capture every essence of capital, its relationship with every other concept. And in like when we get to this point, it becomes clear that when Marx understands capitalism as a structure, each relationship is social, right? Like each concept inside of it that he's explaining is a social relationship. Yeah, that's it, right?
Yeah. Okay. The relation is the irreducible minimum for all units in Marx's conception of social reality. This is really the nub of our difficulty in understanding Marxism, whose subject matter is not simply society, but society conceived of relationally. Capital, labor, value, commodity, etc., are all grasped as relations containing in themselves, as integral elements of what they are, those paths with which we tend to see them externally tied. Essentially, a change of focus has occurred from viewing independent factors which are related to viewing the particular way in which they are related in each factor, to grasping this tie as part of the meaning conveyed by its concept. This view does not rule out the existence of a core notion for each factor, but treats this core notion itself as a cluster of relations. Here, he's trying to dig into how Marx views a concept or views these something such as capitalism, sorry, capital, and it is viewed in relation to as like the that was as like how it was mentioned earlier as yeah as like social relations to other things that also are also part of it, like money, um, land, property, and all of those things. And it is by studying and like the core notion of a factor. Factor here would be like again capital, labor, value. It is by studying all of these, all of the relating, all of its relations to um, material reality and how it affects material reality that we can understand the concept. Does anyone have that?
Does anyone have any questions? Did everyone understand?
Just hoping. Okay. So according according to the common sense view, a social factor is taken to be logically independent of other social factors to which it is related. The ties between them are contingent rather than necessary. They could be something very different without affecting the vital characters of the factors involved. A character which adheres to that part which is thought to be independent of the rest. One can logically conceive, so the argument goes, of any social factor existing without its relation to others. In Marx's view, such relations are internal to each factor. They are ontological relations, what you experience, so that when an important one alters, the factor itself alters. It becomes something else. Its appearance and or function has changed sufficiently for it to require a new concept. Thus, for example, if wage labor disappeared, that is, if the worker's connection to capital radically changed, capital would no longer exist. The opposite is naturally is also true. Marx declares it a tautology that there can no longer be wage labor and there is no longer any capital. Max Hirsch is clearly right, therefore, when he points out that if capital is defined as a means of exploitation and subjection of the laborer, a machine used by a farmer who owned it would not be capital, but it would be capital if he hired a man to operate it. Rather than an obvious criticism, which is how Hirsch intended it, this paradox merely illustrates the character of capital as a social relation. Yeah, unlike as they says in the first line, unlike normally where like we see social factors to be logically independent, like we see capital as one thing, and we see the way the person, the laborer who's going to work for the capitalist as a completely as a someone who's different from that, someone who's not related to it. But in essentially, uh, I, yeah, essentially, capital exists in relation to the laborer uh, or the wage laborer who works for a wage and does not own any capital himself. And thereby, when if there is no wage laborer, there is no capital because that's how it works.
I think here the essence of what he's saying is in the highlighted part. He's saying that such relations are internal to each factor and they are ontological relations, meaning that the very meaning of the being of these factors, like the fact that there is capital and capital is this relationship to that relationship, it is part of its meaning, like we said earlier. So the fact that it exists is because is understood like this. So imagine wage labor disappears. That would mean that capital would also disappear because there would be no reason for it to exist any longer because its meaning has disappeared. Its meaning has been understood as this relationship. So if the other part of the relation, the interrelation, there you require two things, right? So if the second thing is missing, if you remove wage labor, capital would be removed because its meaning is no longer there, if that makes sense. He's just
Yeah.
explaining what he said earlier, you know, like he's just using bigger words to explain, that's all. And yeah, and the
I think
mention of
the
it being social relation. Hmm.
I think the
Say?
example at the end kind of explains it. Like if there is no, if the farmer who owns a
Yeah,
machine
so
is not, yeah, okay, yeah, right.
no, so that's he's saying that this man Max Hurst, I don't know who he is, but he's making a criticism against Marx's language. That okay, if Marx is saying that capital is this, then it would mean that a person who's working a machine is does not own any capital. But if he hires somebody else, that is capital. So he's meaning it as criticism, except Allman is saying that is the essence of the meaning of capital. Like that is how Marx intended the meaning to be. So it's not it's confusing because we're not able to incorporate all the relationships as the meaning of a word. We're very used to looking at a word and its meaning as something very fixed and which does not incorporate all the other relations. Its function with other things, we sort of look at it as an additional factor, except Marx does not look at it that way. He thinks that like if a thing exists, its relationship with everything else in society is part of its own existence. So you can't take um, a thing as a singular object that is in vacuum. It exists because everything else around it exists. Yeah.
In this in this study, I shall use the term relation in two different senses. First, to refer to the factor itself, as when I call capital a relation, and also as a synonym of connection, as in speaking of the relation between factors. Marx and Engels do the same. Besides calling capital a social production relation, I don't know how to spell that, okay. Marx refers to money as a relation of production, the mode of production itself as a relation in which the productive forces are developed, and the list of such remarks is far from complete. His use of relation as a synonym of connection is more extensive still, with the result that verhaltnis probably occurs more frequently than any other expression in Marx's writing, confounding critics and translators alike. It is not entirely satisfying to use relation to convey both meanings, but rather than introduce a new term, I accede to Marx's practice. With this single change, I intend to capitalize relation, henceforth relation, the capital R, when it refers to a factor as opposed to the connection between factors, to aid the readers in making this important distinction. Besides, such obvious alternative to relation as structure, unit, and system suggest a closed, finished character which is belied by Marx's treatment of real social factors. Relation appeals to me, as it must have to him, as a concept which is better adapted to take account of the changes and uncertainties that constitute so large a part of social life. Here, here this is like a reference, like we take into consideration what was said in the first chapter. Like he talks about how Marx uses the same word to mean a lot of things. Yeah, and in this case, he uses relation to mean a factor that is like a factor in like this web of uh, relations that represent a concept, as well as the what connects two concepts in this web. Like, yeah, and thereby, because it to him it represents the same thing, and yeah, then it's just him saying he'll use these two words and change in a different way to um, for us to help us differentiate. Yeah, I think that's it. Okay, the next three sections. Who's gonna do the next three sections?
I'll read it.
Okay.
Mm. The outlook presented here must not be confused with the view that has found great favor among sociologists and others, which holds that social factors are unintelligible except in terms of relations. It is important to realize that Marx took the additional step indicated in his claim that society is man himself in his social relations. On one occasion, Marx specifically berates apparent allies who accuse economists of not paying enough attention to the connections between production and distribution. His complaint is that this accusation is itself based on the economic conception that distribution exists side by side with production as a self contained sphere. Marx's own version of this relationship is presented in such claims as Proudhon is at the same time, oh sorry, what did I just read? Production is at the same time consumption, and consumption is at the same time production. Yeah, so I think it's just making a clarification here, saying that while Marx understands everything, all the concepts as social relations, he understands it as very ontological, as in the meaning of the concept in itself is relational. So, the fact that they are relational is not, just what do you call it? An external thing. It is inside of it's a very internal concept, and this is why he seems to be upset when people say that economists don't consider these factors or that factors, because that's not true, because he's saying that the production is at the same time incorporating all the other concepts such as consumption and distribution and all of those things, because that's how meaning in itself is understood in the Marxist sense. So, yeah, it's just a clarification on his part. Um, should I
Yeah,
just
like
read what's happening in the chat? Oh,
I
yeah.
think yeah. For example, like if we assume like something is produced to eat, like a packet of Lays, the production in and of it, like the fact that it's produced means that it will be consumed and that it will be distributed, because
Mm,
that's how it works. That's how the
yeah,
in like the way Marx sees it. That's the way Marx sees it.
yeah. All right. For the average social scientist, starting with the conception of factors as logically independent of one another, the conjunction of parts in this analysis is mechanical, an intrusion. It exists only where found and disappears once the investigator's back is turned, having to be explained and justified anew. One result is the endless attempts to account for causality and the accompanying need to distinguish between cause and condition. In such studies, one side of the interaction invariably wins out over the other, comes first, leading to the economic determinism or existentialism or other partial positions. So, yeah, like we said earlier, he's making the clarification that, like, when sociologists, understand concepts, as you cannot understand them without social relations. When you say that, what you're not understanding is that Marx already understands each part each concept inside of itself as having these relations. So the problem with the average social scientist is when he takes like a particular concept and he explains that okay, this concept is so and so, and these are the the different relationships it has with other things. He's making a distinction between the meaning of the concept and the fact that it has a relationship with another concept. But Marx is never doing that. For Marx, every concept is in itself relationality. The fact that there is two social things, two social concepts, and they're related is part of the meaning of the concept itself. So the problem when you do what the average social scientist does is that each time you're gonna have to keep repeating all these relational concepts. You're gonna have to keep saying that okay, when this reacts with this, this happens, and you have to keep saying it at each point, and it just makes it harder to understand meaning, and it introduces the problem of causality and condition. Basically, something causes something else to happen. So something comes first, and as a result of it coming first, something else happens. But Marx never looks at things this way. He looks at things as having, the relation is always present, and that relation is what creates changes in a way. So if that's a bit confusing right now, it's going to get cleared eventually. And if you have doubts now, just interrupt me and ask or put it in the chat, because I don't want to keep asking if everything is clear. So yeah, scroll. In Marx's case, all conjunction is organic, intrinsic to the social units with which he is concerned and part of the nature of each. That it exists may be taken for granted. On this view, interaction is properly speaking inner action. It is inner connections which he claims to study. Of production, distribution, consumption, and exchange, Marx declares mutual interaction takes place between the various elements. Such is the case with every organic body. What Marx calls mutual interaction, a reciprocal effect, is only possible because it occurs within an organic body. This is the case with everything in Marxism, which treats its entire subject matter as different sides of one unit. Yeah, so this is basically what I said earlier, that the relationships and the interactions between each concept in this structure, is a very internal reaction. It already exists. It's the fact that it exists in itself can be taken for granted. Nobody needs to attain any causality in this matter, and the nature of each concept is part of its meaning when you explain it. And what else is here? Chill interaction takes place. Yeah, this is just basically what I already said. Don't want to repeat it. We'll move on.
Yeah.
Scroll. Um, so, it is in this context that we must place Marx's otherwise confusing and confused use of cause and determine. There are not some elements which are related to the factor or event in question as causes, and others as conditions. Instead, we find as internally related parts of whatever is said to be the cause or determining agent everything that is said to be a condition, and vice versa. It is this conception that permits Engels to say that the whole of nature has caused life. Yeah, so this is exactly what I was saying earlier, that there's no need to account for causality, because in Marx's understanding, these concepts, the fact that they exist like this means that it is probable that it will cause something of this sort to happen. So he doesn't need to account for causality. He doesn't need to mention that this is the determining agent and this is the thing that it has caused, because the fact that this is the nature of the concept that we are talking about at any given time means that this the fact that it can cause something else to happen is inbuilt in its nature. So uh, I'm thinking of an example I can use. mm, I can't come up with something right now. Hopefully I'll make it clear eventually. Yeah, I'll continue. In practice, however, cause and determine are generally used to point to the effect produced by any entity in changing one or more of the relations that make up other entities. But as each one develops with the direct and indirect aid of everything else, operating on various levels, to single out on any aspect as the determining one can only be a way of emphasizing a particular link in the problem under consideration. Marx is saying that for this factor, in this context, this is the influence most worth noting, the relation which will most aid our comprehension of the relevant characteristics. Yeah, so when Marx is talking about a particular concept, so earlier in like last week we were looking at wage labor and capital and all of those things. So in that context, when he's talking about particular concept, he's emphasizing particular relationships, and this means again when he's talking about particular concepts, it is always implicit that every other relationship this concept has is implicit in the meaning, but he doesn't need to mention them every time, because with regard to what he's focusing on at the moment when he's talking about wage labor, this is the most important interrelation that we must focus on, because this is what will help us understand wage labor better. But the fact that wage labor behaves a different way in a different scenario, does not need to be accounted for, because that is always implicit in the meaning and the concept of wage labor.
think
Okay.
I think something like that.
Yeah.
An example for what was in the last paragraph could be like what we talked about, like during the first chapter, the economic base and the superstructure, and how Marx, when
Mm.
Marx says the means of production determine the society that we live in. He is saying that
Mm-hmm.
like the economy is something worth noting, but it causes all of these things. And as we said, the scientific, the technology, the social society, like the way, the religion, the education, all of those things
Mm.
affect it back, and thereby that's how it works. There's no single thing that causes this, and once again, like there is no economic determinism. This is, yeah,
One
you
of the
know,
ways it reacts with these
yeah,
concepts. Yeah. So I think a more simplistic example, like completely, moving away from all this, is, it made me understand this better, is that, when we talk about our relationships with our mothers, the fact that your mother is a person and probably has a job and probably goes to work, and over there she's nobody's mother, she's a mother obviously, but over there she's an employee, and that is her functionality over there. But that does not mean that when she comes home she stops being, whatever her profession is. She's just, her functionality differs when she once she gets home. So in that scenario, this concept of a person, functions as both a mother and both whatever employee. You get what I'm trying to say? So, right. Oh, no mind. Okay. Yeah. Scroll. The whole at rest which I have been examining is but a limiting case of the whole in movement. For, in Paul Lafargue's words, Marx's highly complicated world is in continual motion. Change and development are constantly occurring. Structure is but a stage in the process. Okay, so far when we were talking about the structure and each component, the components that form the structure and all of that, we've been, analyzing them as fixed and like not, subject to immediate change and all of that stuff. But the truth is, all of that is true. Each part of, each component of the structure is constantly changing, causing the structure in itself to change, and therefore it is in continual motion. And that is how, these relationships and this structure and this concept, all of that can be understood better. So change and development are constantly happening as we interact, because this is a social relationship. All of these are social relationships. As we interact in our everyday life and as it goes by, years and months, change and development is part of that process, and it incorporates itself into the meaning. So yeah, I'll get into that. To introduce the to introduce the temporal dimension into the foregoing analysis, we need only view each social factor as internally related to its own past and future forms, as well as to the past and future forms of surrounding factors. Capital for Marx is what capital is, was, and will be. He says of money and commodities, before the production process they were capital only in intention, in themselves, in their destiny. It is in this manner too that labor is seen in the product it will soon become, and the product in the labor it once was. In short, development, no matter how much facelifting occurs, is taken as an attribute of whatever undergoes development. So yeah, this is what Isa was saying in the chat. That each concept is understood in a very what conditional sense, as in the sense that what capital will become in the future is always part of the meaning of what it is right now, as in it is always probable that capital will react a particular way with these things as time goes on. So the fact that capital was in a particular structure earlier means that the concept of capital has incorporated in itself what it once was and what it is right now and what it will become. So it's not that as time goes on the concept of capital is undergoing so much of a change that it becomes another concept. It is still capital, except that now it has changed and developed into a different stage. So likewise with each concept in the Marxist system, this is true. So here are like the examples here are actually really good for this, because he's saying before a product is made, in the production process it is always implicit that this is the product that's going to be made, and once the product is made, the product will incorporate the entire labor process that has gone into it. So even though these relationships may not be external, you can't materially understand them, these relationships are internal and they're always part of the concept. mm, is that clear?
Yeah. I think could like the example of how a machine that we use for to make something is capital, and at the same time when we make the product that we uh, are going to sell, it is also capital, and then when we sell it and we get money for it, that is also capital. Uh,
Yeah. So
yeah,
each part, so okay, if you take a machine in its like singularity, each part of the machine that forms the machine in itself contains the value and the what do you call it, the meaning of the machine. So even before it was put together and made into a machine, it was probable that it could be put together and made into a machine, right? Like the fact that it is each singular part will form a machine is always part of its like essence and its nature.
yeah,
So it's a little bit philosophical, but you get the point.
yeah.
All right. The present, according to this relational model, becomes part of a continuum stretching from a definable past to a knowable future. Tomorrow is today extended. To speak of such a relation between the present and the future within the context of formal logic would indicate belief in a vitalistic principle, divine will, or some other metaphysical device. But here, all social change is conceived of as a coming to be of what potentially is, as the further unfolding of an already existing process, and hence discoverable by a study of this process taken as a spatial temporal relation. The destiny of money is rooted in its existing structure. So is the destiny of any society. What will become of it, or more accurately, what is likely to become of it, is pieced together by an examination of the forces, patterns, and trends that constitute the major existing relations. In this result of It is the result of such research into any particular factor or set of factors that is conveyed by Marx's concept law. So yeah, this is what I said. Like, but if you take the entire concept of time, the fact that you know the way you can understand time with this conception is that the past is stretching into the future and into the, into the present and into the future. So it's not clearly defined, marked out categories that this is the past and this is the present and this is the future. It's that, you know so here's the second line is actually pretty good. It's saying tomorrow is today extended. So the fact that today is going to, seep into what we call tomorrow is always implicit in the nature of time, right? So it doesn't have to be clearly defined. So like like Shrutan said earlier, the fact that a concept becomes capital and after it reacts a particular way, it still is capital because that is the nature of the concept at hand. And with regards to money, it is the way money behaves in future, the way money will behave once a different component is added into the structure, is always implicit in the nature of money. So the way money exists now is probably indication that in the future when so and so happens in the economy, it will react in this way. Money will like have this value, it will behave in this manner, and so on. So here he's saying what will become of it and what is likely to become of it. So in this, if you understand it in this context, you can probably begin to like, predict that this is how things will go, or this is the probable, course of action, and so on. All right.
Yeah.
Okay.
Yes.
Oh wait, I forgot to mention the last line where he says, okay, yeah, it is a result of such research into any particular factor or set factors that is conveyed by Marx's concept law. So, like I said, if you understand the nature of money, if you understand money as a relationship between so and all of that stuff, you can probably tell, like, when certain things happen in your country, that okay, this is what is going to happen because money is like this and these things are like that. So the research that goes into each of these social factors, so when you begin to understand that each of these social factors are relationships of this sort, and as time goes by and things change and whatever, all of that put in together, this is how it will react. Once you look into it and once you realize, once you go into the research, that is what Marx is understanding of the word law is. So when Marx uses the word law, when he's saying that this is what the law of so and so is, this is what he's actually trying to say. And it'll become clearer because he's actually putting a lot of effort into explaining law later on. So yeah, I'll just go move on and I'll talk about it later. Um, The common sense view recognizes two types of laws: inductive laws, which are generalizations based on the result of empirical research, and deductive laws, which are a priori statements about the nature of the world. For the first, evidence is relevant, and the predictions it occasions are never more than probable. For the second, evidence is irrelevant, and the predictions occasioned are necessary. Marx's laws possess characteristics that we associate with both of these types. So yeah, so you in the way we understand law, the way we've scientifically been able to make definitions of law is that there are inductive laws and there are deductive laws. So inductive laws is based on observation, and that is empirical research, like things, based off of how you observe two things reacting, you will predict that this is how it will react in another scenario, and that is how you make general laws. But when it comes to deductive laws, it is more of a theoretical reasoning. Okay, so there is, you're perhaps theorizing that okay, there's a thing and this is how it would react. So it does not really take into account any observation or any the how in reality it may work. So what Marx is doing is he's actually mixing up both of these laws. So he's obviously very interested in empirical research. He's never straying away from how he observes everything, because that's what we started the chapter with. But at the same time, he's also theorizing that this is how it could be. So he's taking empirical research and he's using it to make theory, essentially. That is how he you know creates his laws. um,
Yeah, wait. Isha has some. Oh,
yes,
I will just
like
read a statement. Isn't this why we say we can't get to socialism with the forms only? Yeah, I think so.
Yeah, correct. So when you reform the already existing nature of capital, right? So capital is always going to exist that way. But if you remove wage labor, like we said earlier, then capital is not going to exist that way. It will cease to exist because it's no longer related to wage labor, and its meaning in its entirety has changed, making it no longer capital. So yeah, correct.
Yeah, okay.
Okay. Um, Like inductive laws, Marx's laws are based on empirical research. Unlike them, however, his laws are not concerned with independent events whose ties with each other and with surrounding circumstances are contingent. Marx says that in political economy, law is chance. The elements related have no ties other than those actually uncovered by research. Whereas for Marx, the relations he discovers are considered already present as real possibilities in the relations which precede them. They exist, they rest importantly in relations. So I think this is what I just said. Yeah, Marx says that in political economy, law is trend. So he is, concerned with empirical evidence, how things are actually working out right now, the observations he's making. But at the same time, he's not concerned with how each individual factor is working, because again, like we said, these internal relations are implicit in the meaning of each concept. So yeah, that's all that's here. There's nothing to be concerned about. As regards deductive laws, Marx's laws also deal with the nature of the world, but do so on the basis of evidence and are forever being modified by evidence. As a result, they cannot be encapsulated in simple formula which hold true for all time. Still, strictly speaking, all Marx's laws are tautologies. Given Given these are A's relations, this is what A must become, and in the becoming, A may be said to obey the law of its own development. Such laws express no more necessity than that contained in the particular group of relations for which they are standing in. The very uncertainties in the situations are their uncertainties. Yet, by including within the law all possible developments prefigured by the relevant relations, the law itself may be said to be necessary. All that happens to a factor is the necessary working out of its law. Consequently, rather than coloring Marx's findings in any way, it is his findings which lend these laws their entire character. Yeah, so like I said, earlier, you take any concept, the fact that it will behave a particular way, in the future based off of all your observations of how things are right now is always implicit in uh, the way that A is, and the so yeah,
Yes,
yeah, and go on.
an example would be like last week you said a financial crisis. The fact that a financial crisis will happen is in and of itself inherent to capitalism and the way that it works and all of the things that come with it. I think that's
Yeah, yeah, correct. So, correct. And like, so when Marx makes laws with pertaining to these concepts, so when he's making the law that this will react a particular way, it will always incorporate all these developments in the future. So the fact that in 10 years this is going to happen, Marx may have said, he considered that fact because he's able to incorporate all these developments. He's able to realize that when this concept in the future, when things are changing in this particular manner, will react in this way, is always part of the law. So it's not that his laws are in a way fixed, or a definition that is never experiencing change. It is constantly being modified. So as time is going, each of these concepts is going to go through a change, because that is how things work, right? So nothing is ever staying fixed in our lives. So that is true for all these conceptions. These conceptions are just simply an expression of reality. So if reality is constantly going through change, that simply means that all these concepts, the concepts of capital and production and all of those things, are experiencing that exact level of change, and that is implicit. Yeah. Uh, the relations the relations bound up in any factor generally make one kind of development more probable than other, and Marx often uses law to refer to this development alone. Law in this sense is the same as tendency, and on one occasion Marx goes as far as to say that all economic laws are tendencies. Exactly. So what we just said, the fact that it's not, a definitive concept. When he says law, he's not meaning that this is the only way it will react. He's saying that this way it has reacted has always been a part of this concept. So the fact that it will react in a different way is always implicit, and which is why the word tendency is more suited than law. But he's using law to like make a point and all of that. Yeah. Was this one chapter that I read?
One section, yeah. No,
Okay.
wait, like you read two, there's just one more. I think this one's more.
Okay. Until this point, the discussion has been limited to social factors which are generally recognized as such: capital, labor, class, etc., though Marx's interpretation of them was shown to be highly unusual. However, in seeking favorable vantage points from which to analyze capitalism, a system contained relationally in each of its parts, Marx sometimes felt obligated to create new parts. This was simply a matter of mentally carving up the whole in a different manner for a particular purpose. The result is, in effect, a new social factor, a new unit in which to think about and refer to society. Perhaps the most important new social unit created in this way is the relations of production, the core of which lies in the complex interaction of production, distribution, exchange, and consumption. Another is surplus value. These two relations occupy a central position in Marx's work. Yeah, so uh, other than the relationships that already exist, Marx felt the need to like create a new concept, and you saw a particular relationship that required a different name. A new concept had to be incorporated into this structure because he felt like this concept is behaving in a completely different way that requires a new category. So one example is relations of production, and another one is surplus value. These concepts were understood very elementarily before him, and he's actually contributed a lot to creating a very creating a completely new understanding of it, and they both are very important in his work. So the novelty of having the novelty of having the relations of production as a subject matter becomes evident when we consider the limited concern of most capitalist economists. The latter are interested in studying, more particularly in measuring, what goes on in the economy, a sector of life artificially separated from other sectors whose necessary links with human beings as regards both means and results are seldom investigated. Yeah, so the reason these concepts have never been explored, the reason they're novel concepts is because these concepts never concerned capitalist economy. So when they look at the economy, they're measuring how the economy is functioning, how much it's creating, and so on and so on. But the fact that the economy is not separate from every other aspect of our life, the fact that incorporates, it is working itself into every other aspect of social life, is never something they considered, which is why Marx felt the need in the first place to create these novel concepts like what relations of production.
Surplus value.
And yeah. Okay. What kind of productive activity goes on in a society where people obtain what they want through the exchange of value equivalence? The kind of political, cultural, religious, and social life fosters such exchange and is in turn fostered by it. These questions are beyond the bounds of relevance established by capitalist economists, and they are but they are well within the bounds set by Marx. He tells us in Capital 1, for example, that he wants to examine why is labor represented in the value of its product and labor time by the magnitude of that value. This is really a question about how the particular economy which capitalist economists are content to describe came into existence and how it manages to maintain itself. By conceptualizing his subject matter as relations of production, as a union of the main processes involved, Marx facilitates his efforts to deal with this wide ranging problem. The result, Capital, is not properly speaking an economic treatise, but, as many readers have noted, a work on social praxis. Yeah. So it's basically what I said, because capitalist economists are not concerned with, like he's saying, the political, cultural, religious, and social implications of what happens in the economy, and how these all of these are in many ways interrelated. They're not, they didn't bother to go to that extent, but Marx thinks it's important because, all of he's understanding all of these as, a large structure of interrelations, right? So which is why for him it was important to, you know create these new components, and, give them these, the meaning that he did. Yeah, that's it.
That's action. Nikhil,
Yeah.
yeah, take the next three.
Uh, yeah,
Yeah.
give me 1 second.
Done?
Oh, that
Yeah, can you
the
guys hear
third
me?
one.
Yeah, yeah, we can hear you.
Okay.
Yeah.
Returning to Marx's discourse, the problem of misinterpretation arises from what might be called his practice of making definitions of all his descriptions. Whatever Marx discovers about any factor, particularly if he considers it to be an essential characteristic, is incorporated into the meaning of its denoting term, becomes part of its concept. Marx's concepts then are meant to convey to us the already structured information they express for him. It is in this way that they acquire a truth value distinct from that of the statements which embody them. This is basically him going back to Marx's what he was talking about earlier, that every concept that Marx introduces already embodies everything that Marx wants to tell uh, about the thing. For example, capital itself. When Marx says capital, he's talking about it already embodies everything, including capital, the relations between people, like as the capital as a relation between people, or capital as means of production, or capital as anything else. So when he says capital, he's talking about the whole characteristic of capital, not just any particular thing, any particular part. Yeah. So this creates, so he's basically saying that this creates some confusion when you read about Marx.
Yeah, I
So
think the last line there is important, where he says that Marx's conceptions are like it is in this, like it is in the way that it's a structure, and like once again, like he's reiterating it, the fact what Nikhil just said, it's because it is like this that they are true. You know, it is because it's expressed in a structure that it acquires a value of truth. I think that's what it means.
yeah, is that he's basically describing the whole thing, the thing as a whole. So it acquires a truth value distinct from that statement. So that it already exists and you can't
Yeah,
deny that it's true. I think that's what it means. If anyone has anything to add there, you can. Otherwise, I'll continue.
yeah,
Okay. Therefore, whatever Marx understands about his society, including its processes of change and the projection he has made from them, is already contained in each of the major concepts he uses to explain what it is he understands. Such meaning lies heavy on Marx's terms. It is this which allows Marx to equate economic categories with historical laws, and which makes logic a synonym for law in Marxism. Law refers to relations in the real world, while logic, as Marx ordinarily uses it, refers to the refers to these same relations as reflected in the meanings of the relevant concepts. Marcuse offers the same insight when he claims that Marx's categories are negative and at the same time positive. They present a negative state of affairs in the light of its positive solution, revealing the true situation in an existing society as the prelude to its passing into a new form. All the Marxian concepts extend, as it were, in these two dimensions, the first of which is the complex of given social relations. Second, the complex of elements inherent in the social reality that made for its transformation into a free social order. Yeah. So here, what is Marx saying? Therefore, whatever Marx understands about society, including its process of chain of relations, already done. So basically, is again reiterating that whatever concept that Marx uses, it is everything he Marx understands about society or about that concept is already contained within the definition of that concept or within the term that he uses. So Allman is saying that this allows Marx to equate economic categories with historic laws and makes logic a synonym for law and Marxism. I don't understand this. Can anyone explain it?
I wasn't paying attention. What part?
The it is this which allows Marx to equate economic categories with historic laws. The second line, I think.
Yeah,
Uh,
page 21, the second line.
what is before it? I was so tired from reading my part, I wasn't paying attention.
The same
Therefore,
thing.
Therefore, whatever Marx says about a
yeah,
society, including its causes and changes in productions, he is made from them is already contained. Okay. Um, I think this is what we said earlier. The
yeah, that
fact
is
that he
what we said
can,
earlier.
yeah, the fact that economic categories and historic, the fact that as time goes on, like historic loss is somehow considered separate from economic categories, except for Marx. He does not look at it that way because we just said, right, like time, it's an extension, and there's no need to make that separation because his understanding of meaning in itself incorporates all of those things, which is why when he says logic, he also probably means law because, like we said earlier, it's a tendency for something to behave in a particular way. So, in the common sense way,
Okay,
logic is like ingana and law is like angana, except for him, it's not. I think that's what he's saying.
okay, yeah. Did everyone understand that?
Isa has a question in the chat. What
Think
does negative and positive categories mean? Does negative I think this is with relate what you said earlier,
that
something you mentioned. I was not paying attention.
no, I think it's in relation to the quote. This guy Mark uses quote, and I'm
Ha,
reading it.
okay, like that.
Yeah.
Yeah,
It
that.
sounded. It yeah. It sounds
Marxist
like yeah.
categories are negative and at the same time positive. They represent the negative state of affairs in the flow. Okay, I think he's saying, yeah, like what Isha said itself, he's showing that it's basically showing a particular state of affairs that is changing or that is passing away,
Mm.
and Marx is trying to show what comes after. I think that is what it means in
Yeah.
light of its positive solution.
Yeah. Like it is.
Oh,
It is like yeah. It is gonna change, and by changing, it's gonna like be destroyed, and there's something new is gonna come. Right? That could be it.
I don't think he's saying it's going to be destroyed. It's going to change into
Gonna
Yeah.
change
a
into something
positive
else.
thing. Yeah, into something
Yeah.
else. And that thing is understood as positive, whereas the fact that that is understood as positive means that what was before it is understood as negative. So at the same
Negative.
time, this thing can be both negative and positive.
Basically,
Yeah.
that Marx sees things in change, in a state of change. Right.
Could
Correct.
an
Yeah,
example
correct.
be like the fact that like actual capitalist society has to at one point change into a socialist
You know,
or
actually, a good example would be that, in capital, like we understand like the structure of capitalism as something that has negative connotations and all of those things, right?
yeah,
But as individual things work inside of that structure, there are very positive reforms that will help people, correct? So,
yeah,
women are able to go and, get abortions and all that stuff, and whatever, like things, whatever it is, like I don't want to mention any specifics, but that means that there is like positive components within a negative structure. And again, the fact that we view it as negative is because we look at it this way, you know what I mean? So
yeah,
Yeah.
yeah, like that. Right.
Yeah, he shows it in the like towards the last sentence. And the second, the complex of elements inherent in the social reality that make for its transformation into a free social order. So
yeah,
basically, whatever elements, like it's taking a social reality and whatever elements that can transform it into a new social order, it's seen in a positive light, into a free social order, seen in the positive light. And whatever that pulls it away, or that pulls it, that anchors it into the existing, so reality itself is seen in a negative light, I guess.
Mhm. Okay.
yeah,
Yeah. Okay, I'll continue now.
Right.
That readers make any sense of Marxist terminology at all suggests that many of the relations he sees in reality correspond more or less to our common sense view of the world, which is not much to assume, and that it is these relations which constitute the core meaning of most of his concepts. Yeah, I'll just continue through it. I think this is very straightforward, right?
yeah,
Yeah.
Though each of Marx's major concepts has the theoretical capacity to convey the entire analysis made with it, in practice, Marx's current interest governs the degree to which the relations bound together in any social factor, and hence the meaning of its covering concept, are extended. As Marx moves from one problem to the next, whole new areas inside each social relation becomes relevant, and some areas which were relevant in the previous context cease being so. In this way, what was formerly assumed is expressed directly, and what was expressed is now assumed. Class, for instance, has a vital role in explaining the state, but only a small part in accounting for exchange and the size of the relation. Class, in Marx's thought, and the meaning of class in Marx's writing varies accordingly. Okay. So it's here, though each of Marx's major concepts has theoretical capacity to convey entire analysis, in practice, Marx's current interest was the degrees to which separation from together. Okay. Yeah, so basically saying that although the concept that Marx uses can be used throughout, like the entire analysis can be made with those concepts itself, but in practice, when he analyzes particular situation, certain factors become more relevant than the others. So as Marx moves on from one problem to the next, whole new areas inside each social relation become relevant, and some areas which were relevant in the previous context cease being so. That's what I said right now.
yeah,
So he gives an example of class, for instance, and that class, basically the class has a very vital role in explaining the state. But when it comes to other factors like accounting, or like exchange, or other factors, let's take caste for example in India's scenario, the relevance of class actually change goes away. Like class is no longer that relevant. Like class is not the primary factor that you need to account for.
yeah.
Yeah.
I think before that, like the paragraph before that is just him trying to say again, like that when we read Marx, the way we normally try understand his concepts is by relating it to the way we see things. Like
Um,
we just take things that we agree with in a way. like that we can understand uh, as like ready made, like with our with the way we see the world. And
Yeah,
yeah, I think
yeah, that he sees that we interpret Marx in a way, in the common sense view.
world, yeah.
Yeah, I'll continue. Yeah. It is this practice which is responsible for what was referred to earlier as Marx's manipulation of classificational boundaries, both those which were generally accepted and those which he himself seemed to lay down elsewhere in his work. Yet each such restriction of the social whole is merely practical, a means of allowing Marx to get on with his current task. Should he ever want to extend the size of any factor, and hence the meaning of its concept to its relational limits, he can do so. Thus, we learn man, much as he may therefore be a particular individual, is just as much the totality, the ideal totality, the subjective existence of thought and experience society present for itself. So basically, saying that this practice of Marx allows for him to constrain his analysis to a particular limits or expand it according to what he wants to analyze, and so that he may get on with his current task of analyzing a particular part of society. And this often gets him accused of manipulating classificational boundaries, which were either generally accepted or which he already put forth earlier in his works.
Yeah.
Yeah, it seemed to lay. I think he's trying to say that like Marx never really classified things, and therefore he like even though it may seem like he has classified like certain things into
Mhm.
categories, since they don't exist to him, he can like go on changing like the size of his classification to suit his research into to suit what he's studying.
Yeah, I think that's what. Yeah. Thus, we learn man as such may a man, much as he may therefore be a particular individual, is just as much the totality, the ideal totality, the subjective existence of thought and experience society present for itself.
Yeah,
A-
I think.
Any idea what this is?
Yeah, I think
I
it's
don't
he's
know
trying to
what that
say that.
means.
Oh, I think he's trying to say that like here in the case of class, right? Like it might sorry, but like I
The
think in the
last
case,
sentence.
yeah, the subjective existence of thought and experience of society percent.
Oh, does that mean that while a person is, an individual person, that person is also like an
So
expression of how
Reflection of society.
think, yeah, of society, yeah, of society and the, existence of thought in general. Is that what it means?
um,
I
uh,
think
yeah.
so.
I'm a little
And is that
confused.
I think it's like he's not giving up the man's individuality, like man's capability of individual expression, but he's rooting
Mm,
it in the existing society itself. Like that man,
mm,
while he is an individual, he still experienced
mm.
like that he's still
Yeah, the
affected by
ideal
society.
totality. Okay, yeah, 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 yeah.
Yeah,
Subjective, yeah, okay.
so it's a thought and okay, yeah. Like it's both the individuality, which is the subjective existence of thought, I am assuming, and the
Yeah,
experience society, which is like the totality of it. I think
Yeah,
he's
yeah.
given the
Basically, it's
example
both things,
at the same time.
as in like a thing is not one thing, it could be many things. I think that's what
yeah,
it essentially, yeah. Okay.
I think he gave that example to sort of explain how or like why Marx is able to manipulate his definitions to include like change his definitions like this or
Yeah.
concepts.
He
I
mentioned
think
that earlier
definitions. Yeah.
also, no? that like with
Yeah,
regard to what he's talking about, so if he's talking about a particular topic at hand, he's not going to be talking about every single possible
yeah,
Hmm.
thing with regard to it, but only what is needed to analyze that topic. So but
yeah.
that doesn't mean that the topic doesn't include everything else like that.
Yeah. Okay. I'll continue now. If each of Marx's concepts has such breadth, actual or potential, and includes much of what is also expressed by other concepts, how does Marx decide on any given occasion which one to use? Why, for example, call interest, which for him is also capital, interest and not capital? This is really the same problem approached from the other side. This is, whereas before I accepted Marx's nomenclature and tried to find out what he meant, I am now asking, given his broad meaning, why does he offer the names that he does? The unorthodox answer to the given to the first question has made this second one of special importance. Uh, I think this is very straightforward. I'll just continue.
Yeah.
It may appear that I have only left Marx a nominalist way out, but this is not so. The opposition between the view that the world gives rise to our conceptions and the view that naming is an arbitrary process is in any case a false one. The real problem is to discover the various precise ways in which in which what actually exists in nature as well as in society affects the way we conceive of and label it, and how the latter in turn reacts upon what exists, particularly upon what we take to be natural structures. In short, this is a two-way street, and to be content to travel in only one direction is to distort. Marx's own practice in naming takes account of both the real world as it is, and his conceptualization of it, which decides, as distinct from determines, what it can be. The former is seen in Marx's acceptance of the core notion of each factor, which is simply what the factor, being what it is, strikes everyone that it is. The idea of is of necessity quite vague, and the latter stands out in the decisive importance he attributes to the function of each factor, grasped as any part of its core notion in the particular subsystem of society which he is examining. Okay, it may appear that I have only left Marx and nominalist way out, but it's not so. The opposition between you and okay. So here, Coleman is basically tackling the idea that naming something is a very arbitrary process. That he in the first line itself he says that it is the idea that naming is an arbitrary process is a false one. The real problem,
Can I add something? I think like
yeah,
he in the last paragraph he mentions that since he has like normally we consider naming to be an arbitrary process, but since Ullman has explored like why Marx uses this nomenclature and the fact that Marx uses so many different words to mean the same thing or the same word to mean different things has like made the fact that naming being arbitrary, we cannot leave naming as arbitrary because we need to answer that question to understand why Marx does all these things.
yeah, yeah, that's
Yeah.
yeah.
Yeah, continue.
Okay, I think that itself explains the whole paragraph.
Oh. Yeah, like we need to consider both things.
Yeah,
And this real problems to discover where.
okay, I'll
Okay.
continue now.
Yeah, I think an example of this is like it says the former is seen as Marx's acceptance of the core notion of each factor. And for example, a core notion could be prices. Like an example of like what we read in wage, labor, and capital last week. Prices is a thing. Prices there are
Yeah,
And when talking about wages, wages is a form of prices. And this is why he like you wages is the price that is paid for the laborer, for the
Yeah.
labor power of a person. And
Huh.
and this is how I think this is how is an example of that.
Yeah, I think so. Because yeah, it's similar to what he started with. He started with telling why Marx uses the term interest and not capital, while interest Marx considers as capital itself.
Yeah.
So it is basically to account for the particular nature of interest or particular nature
Yeah.
of capital in the form of interest. So, like when you're talking about prices and wages, that also comes up because wages are while wages are prices, wages have a particular importance other as opposed to other kinds of prices, right?
Yeah.
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 So you
Totally.
it makes sense to give it a special name.
Different. Yeah. Different name.
Different name. Yeah.
Yeah.
Distinct name.
Okay, I'll continue now.
Yeah.
In setting out what can and cannot be called fixed capital, Marx says it is not a question here of a definition, which things must be made to fit. We are dealing here with definite functions which must be expressed in definite categories. Thus, capital in a situation where it functioned as interest would be called interest and vice versa. However, a change in function only results in a new name if the original factor is actually conceived to be what is now functioning as. That is, capital can only act appear to be interest and hence never really deserve its name unless we are able to conceive of the two as somehow one. This, of course, is just what Marx's relational conception allows him to do. Through its internal ties to everything else, each factor is everything else viewed from this particular angle, and what applies to them necessarily applies to it. Taken in this broad sense, thus each factor has, in theory, the potential to take the names of others when it functions as they do, that is, in ways associated with their core notions. Okay. In setting on what can and cannot be called fixed capital, Marx says it's not a business definition. Here we are dealing, it is not, so when dealing with the question of fixed capital, Marx says that it is not a question of a definition which things must be made to fit. We are dealing here with definite functions which must be expressed in definite categories.
So I think it
What
means
is
that
the
when I think it means that when what is the thing that he's talking about, interest and capital, right? So when capital
yeah.
functions in a particular way, he's like this is interest, but it's the same as capital. It's the same thing, but it has a different function in this particular part section or
Mhm.
whatever,
Yeah.
right? So yeah, so it's not that they are two different things. So when it is basically the same thing, but it has a different functionality. So he's like, this is a definition I'm giving to this functionality. So like he said earlier, what is wage and price? So price becomes wage in a particular context, but it remains price. It's still price, but it's given the
Yeah.
term wage, right? So yeah, it's that only he's doing. So what is he
Okay.
saying
Yeah.
in yeah, yeah,
I
it's that
think
only.
I think like the last sentence explains it a bit better. Like thus explains the reason why Marx can use so many uh, or like
Mm.
so many words to describe the same thing, and all of that is because
Yeah.
like when in this case when capital functions in a certain way, it's interest, and that's why he's calling it interest.
Mhm. Yeah.
Yeah,
Yeah. The same thing that we told earlier.
yeah,
Yeah.
When Marx calls theory a material force, or when Engels refers to the state as an economic factor, they are misusing words only on our standard. As on the basis of the relational conception, Theory and the and state are being given the names of their own facets whose core functions they are performing. Thus, Marx says in the instance quoted that theory becomes a material force once it gets a hold of men. That is, once it becomes a driving factor in their lives, strongly influencing character and actions. This role is generally performed by a material force, such as the mode of production, but theory can also perform it, and when it does, it becomes a material force. So basically, the same thing that we told earlier when theory, Marx calls theory a material force, when the theory actually does the function of a material force. That is, when it actually becomes a driving factor in the lives of men, influencing their character and actions.
Yeah.
Yeah, so it's
Yeah.
basically the same thing that we told earlier. When theory functions
Maybe
as a
it's an
material force, it
example.
becomes a material force. Yeah, it's an example for what Marx told, what
Yeah.
Allman is saying earlier. Okay. Uh, Kaspersky. Okay. To understand Marx's nomenclature, however, it is not enough to know that naming attaches to function, which in turn is conceived of within a relational whole. The question arises whether the particular function observed is objective, actually present in society, or subjective, there because Marx sees it to be. The answer is that it is both. The functions according to which Marx ascribes names exist, but it is also true that they are conceptualized in a manner which allows Marx to take note of them. Other people viewing the same raw facts with another conceptual scheme may not even observe the relation he has chosen to emphasize. This, as we shall see, is the main obstacle to grasping Marx's theory of alienation. So here is basically saying that whenever Marx, if you want to understand Marx's nomenclature or the way Marx names things, it is important to look understand this as being both as the particular function being observed in in an objective manner that is actually present in society, or in a way that Marx sees it to be that is subjective. That Allman is saying that it is important to look at both if we want to actually find out why Marx names something like let's say why Marx names price as wage in the when it comes in within the wage labor relation. Yeah, that it. Do you guys have anything to add?
No, no, I think that's pretty
Okay.
clear, no?
Yeah.
Yeah. For example, have anyone asked anything? Okay.
No, no, no.
For example, when Marx calls the worker's productive activity variable capital, he is labeling a function that only he sees. In this case, because this is how such activity appears from the point of view of the process of creating surplus value, a unit that Marx himself introduced. It is only after we finish reading capital that and accept the new concept of surplus value that variable capital ceases to be an arbitrary name for labor power. Generally speaking, we understand why Marx has used a particular name to the extent that we are able to grasp the function he referred to, which in turn depends on how similar his conception of the relevant factors is to our own. Okay. Yeah, so Marx, another term that Marx uses for like labor power is variable capital. And you can see that like when you go through capital or when you go through anything related to Marx, you can see that when you're discussing about the circulation of capital, you would always Marx or anyone who's trying to explain Marx, he'll be always using variable capital instead of labor power. But when you're trying to explain, like when you're trying to explain the process of exploitation or something like that, you will always use the term labor power. So it is basically saying that the concepts of variable capital is associated with a particular function. That is when labor power acts as capital in the circulation process, right?
Yeah. Yeah.
Yeah, I think here what else that is that like the subjective part of it is that uh, the objective thing is that it exists and we see it, but the subjective part is that when he sees it, it's him naming it. Therefore,
Yeah,
it's subjective.
yeah. The objective
Yeah.
is that it exists, like I said, but the subjective is when like he wants to explain this particular process.
Yeah.
So he gives it this particular name. If he wants to explain another process, he'll give it some other name. But what both these names are describing is basically the same thing.
And
What about
with
the
the
last
case of
line?
with the case of surplus value, it's a concept that Marx, introduced, because so in that case the subjective is very highlighted, right? So he was able to
Yeah,
look at it in a particular way, and then he realized, okay, here's something that we have not accounted for, or we haven't like made note of, but I have made note of it, so I'm going to name it surplus value because it's something that so far it exists, because objectively it's over there, but we're not looking into it as a driving force or something that creates something else. So Marx has observed it, he named it surplus value, so in that sense it is both objective and subjective.
yeah.
Yeah.
What about that last line? We understand why Marx is that we are
You
able to
understand?
grasp
Speaking also, Marx has used
which
Pilva name to the extent that we are able to grasp function of the is to our own. I think it means that when once we figure out what the particular name that he's using is referring to, like what the function of it is, we begin to realize that, oh, this is something that exists, in the sense that it's something that, you know, that I I am also able to realize or perceive right now, that he's able, that because he's given it a name. Before he
oh, okay.
made it a concept, it probably existed and we may have seen it, except we didn't understand it as a concept that did all these things.
Hmm.
Yeah, I think that's what he's saying.
Yeah, I think I'll move on.
Yeah.
Marx's concepts, it is clear, have been tailored to fit both his unique vision of capitalism, as Engels says, and his unusual conception of social reality. The great lesson to be drawn from all this is that Marx's concepts are not our own, no matter how much they may appear so. In short, that the fact that Marx uses the same words as we do should not mislead us into believing that he has the same concepts. Words are the property of language and are common to all who use language. Concepts are ideas about the world which find expression in words or words insofar as they contain such ideas are best grasped as the property of the individuals concerned, expressing what he knows as well and as how he knows it. Marx's concepts tell us much more, often, and much less, sometimes, and much different, always, than we think they do. Hence, Engels' reference to the novel meanings Marx gives to familiar terms. So it's basically concluding what we've seen till now, that whatever Marx is like, whatever words that we see in Marx's writings, we should not take it as things that we know already. Like we should not give it a common sense meaning, but rather we should try to why explore it from Marx's own point of view. Otherwise, we will not be able to get what he's actually saying. And that it's important to do that. Otherwise, we'll just end up accusing Marx of uh, random things like economic
Misrepresenting.
determinism. And yeah,
Yeah.
we'll end
And
up
say
misrepresenting him. Yeah.
yeah.
I think that's all here. Does anyone want to add anything?
No.
No.
Okay.
Go on.
Moreover, as if this were not enough, the very sense conveyed by Marx's concepts is unstable. What he understands at any given time of the interrelations which make up social reality is reflected in the meanings of the words he uses. But these interrelations are constantly changing, and further, Marx is forever learning more about them through his research. Hence, Engels' pointed warning that we should not expect to find any fixed cut to measure once and for all applicable definitions in Marx's works. I think it's again reiterating the same point that we've seen earlier.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Shall
That was-
just move on.
yeah.
The lack
Yeah.
of definitions, that is, of statements obviously meant as definitions in Marx's writings, has often been belabored, but it should now be clear what difficulty he had in providing them. Viewing the world as devoid of the clear cut classification and boundaries that distinguish the common sense notion, Marx could not keep a definition of one factor from spilling over into everything. For him, any isolating definition is necessarily one sided and probably misleading. There are critics, such as Sartre, who have accepted Engels' dictum. More typical, on the other hand, is the reaction of Carew Hunt, who is so convinced of the impossibility of such an approach to meaning that he claims against the evidence that Marx does not manipulate language in this way, though his dialectic, according to Carew Hunt, requires that he do so. Basically, unaware of Marx's relational conception, most critics simply cannot take the concepts which are entailed by this conception for what they are. Uh, what is this? I
I think
The
think
same
it's
thing, no? That
yeah,
yeah,
I think
because
it's
they
just
don't
about
same
how
thing.
like
like.
the critics miss the point and they don't
Yeah,
they just
Yeah.
view it
Yeah.
from their common sense perspective and they cannot see that it's Marx views it in a relational conception
yeah,
and
exactly. That they're not looking at it from Marx's point of view, but they are trying to impose their own point of view onto Marx.
then criticize it.
Yeah.
Yeah. What emerges from this interpretation is that the problem Marx faces in his exposition is not how to link separate parts, but how to individuate instrumental units in a social whole which finds expression everywhere. If I am right, the usual approach to understanding what Marx is getting at must be completely reversed from trying to see the way in which labor produces value. We must accept at the outset that a kind of equation between the two. The two social relations express the same whole, as Marx says, value is labor, and try instead to see the ways in which they differ. Marx's law of value is concerned with the metamorphosis of value, with the various forms it takes in the economy, and not with its production by labor. This, and not what Smith and Ricardo had said before, is the economic theory illustrated in the massive volumes of capital. Um, so Goldman is basically saying that the usual approach that you must take on finding out what Marx means should be reversed. That you must accept. I don't get this for particular paragraph. Someone can explain.
Mm, just from trying to see the way in which to
I think
look
it's
at it.
like the
Um,
causality thing I was mentioned earlier of how
yeah, like one thing
instead of
comes before the other. That is
Okay.
not, yeah, that does not exist in the Marxist conception.
yeah,
For him,
but
the relation is there. You have to take it as a given that, the
Ah,
relation between
yeah,
value and
yeah.
labor is there, which is why
and
they
then
have they are the same thing, or it behaves a particular way and so on. So when you take capital,
Mhm.
the way value behaves in each particular, the metamorphosis of value, as he says, it keeps changing when it reacts in this way, in that way, and so on. So if you think of it in a determinist sense, it's going to confuse you, I guess, because something comes and then it changes something else and so on. Except he's not ever saying that. He's saying there's a relationship between them. It's already there. It's internal, and that is how you should look at it,
yeah, and
essentially.
like
Yeah.
why
Mm.
looking at it, by looking at it as a relation, we can then understand what Marx is trying to say.
Yeah, yeah, correct. Okay. Last paragraph. So, two, instead of seeking a strict causal tie between the mode of production and other institutions and practices of society, which precludes complex social interaction, we must begin by accepting the existence. We must begin by accepting the. What is it?
The
Yeah, we must begin by
this
accepting
interaction.
the existence of this interaction and then seek out the ways in which Marx believes that the effects proceeding from the mode of production and other economic factors, narrowly understood, are more important. Such interaction, as we have seen, is a necessary part of each social relation. This and not technological determinism is the conception of history illustrated in all Marx's detailed discussions of political and social phenomena. If Marx is at ease with a foot on each side of the fence, it is because for him, the fence does not exist. In light of this analysis, most of Marx's opponents are guilty of criticizing him for answers to questions he not only did not ask, but given his relational conception of reality, could not ask. Marx's real questions have been lost in the process. They must be rehabilitated.
Yeah.
Yeah. So yeah, so basically, whatever we explained earlier, the problem with the biggest problem here is that people are trying to find out a strict causal tie between the mode of production and other institutions. Like they're trying to view it from a analytical angle, that a cause effect angle, instead of seeing it as a relation that actually exists already. Right.
Yeah.
Right. Yeah.
It's like they're trying to do the what came first, the chicken or the egg.
Yeah.
But the
Yeah. Correct.
Correct.
Yeah.
fact is, both of them already existed. So it's
Yeah.
you don't need to ask that question.
Yeah, like they
Yep.
came into
Exactly.
existence in a relation, not as
Yeah.
a not as separately.
Individual. Yeah. Correct. Yeah. Are we done?
Yeah, we're
Yeah,
done.
that was way too
Okay.
long. I think we
Yeah,
should
That was
very
so
long.
long.
try to limit the sessions to at least 1.5 hours, something.
I
Yeah.
think I think it was 2 hours. Like 2 hours is what we planned.
Yeah, but I feel like 2 hours is like much
2 hours
energy,
seemed to be long.
too much energy
Yeah.
expenditure for just three people reading. I think.
Yeah,
I got so tired after I read.
Oh man,
All right.
yeah.
okay.
Thanks to everyone who was here, and thank you to everyone who is here. Yeah, that's the end of today's session.
Yeah,
If you have any feedback and share, I think I'll start. Yeah, yeah. Thank you, Radha. Thank you for
Raita.
staying around. Raita, Raita.
Yeah,
Yeah.
I think
Yeah.
it's Raita. I've seen her on Twitter. I think yeah, yeah. It was written in
Was it
Malayalam. Raita.
Raita?
No, I think
Isn't
it's
it
It's
me?
Rita actually, but
Radha.
people tend to call me Raita.
Okay.
Thank you guys
Oh,
for reading and
okay.
explaining. It was really nice.
Yeah,
Okay.
yeah. So